Hello and good afternoon to everyone in the Asian time zones. Good morning to our friends from Europe, and thank you for joining us this early. Welcome to the second day of the RIHN 15th International Symposium, Transitioning Cultures of Everyday Food Consumption and Production, Stories from a Post-Growth Future. So this is the second day. Yesterday, we already had one keynote by Arnim Week on overcoming the problem bias and sustainable food economy solutions. Then in the afternoon, in the second part, we had a great first session on regional and regenerative food sheds, where we already touched on things like, for example, narratives of scarcity. This is a topic that we will revisit today. Today we will start with our second keynote by Georgos Kallus, who will talk about limits, degrowth, and environmental justice. After a short break, we will have a Q&A for the keynote from yesterday because due to some logistical issues, we couldn't do that yesterday, so we want to catch up and do this today. After that, we'll take a deep dive into food futures, transdisciplinary processes, and politics with a great group of 5 different speakers from all around the world. So I think today will be a very exciting session, second day. I will be the chair leading you through this day today. My name is Christoph. I hope you'll have a great time today. As always, please put all questions and participation into Slack, not Zoom, because that means that people in other time zones who cannot be with us live today and right now can join in later, and we can have a great discussion across time zones. A couple of points before we get going here. First things, the questions for today's speakers should all go into the respective channels. For example, the 14th keynote channel for questions for Georgos, and the 14th session 2 futures channel for the session later. Then there's also our collaborative hopeful food fiction story, which the link you can find in the announcement channel, where we are trying to co-write a story about hopeful food futures together. At the end of this day, we will have a virtual social gathering in the spatial chat. We tried it out yesterday and it was quite some fun. If you want to tweet about the symposium, and we encourage you to do so, please use the hashtags postgrowthfood and RIHN Symposium for that. And during the break, or if you have a free minute, you can also check out the channels from yesterday where there's still a lot of discussion going on. Okay. With that, let's get going. I would like to introduce our first, our keynote speaker for today, Georgos Kallus, who is joining us at the early time of 7 o'clock in the morning. Thank you very much for that. We appreciate it a lot. Georgos Kallus is one of the leading degrowth scholars in the world, and his work has been really, really vital for a lot of the organizing group here in Kyoto. I think all of my colleagues still remember the first time we saw, some of us saw Georgos, and then when we kind of got our hands on the degrowth vocabulary for New Era book, because it changed pretty much how we looked at the food topic, and it influenced the Feast project quite a lot. So we've been trying to get Georgos to come to Kyoto for a while now, and now we have him virtually, so better than nothing, and we're really happy to have you. With that, we'll get going. We're doing this to avoid any connection issues by playing a video, and then Georgos will be live with us for the questions and answers. So with that, please, let's get started with the video.
I'm very happy to be with you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this very important and exciting, as I see from the program, Symposium. My name is Georgos Kallus. I'm a professor of environmental studies and ecological economics and political ecology at Barcelona. And today I want to share with you some aspects of my research. I'm not a food researcher. I don't work directly on the topics of the conference, but I think I do research that might speak to some of your concerns and might be interesting to share with you, and here also on the Q&A which aspects of it speak more to your areas of concern and what connections and bridges and conversations we can have. So let me start. So a small trivia before I start is for you to tell me at the end of the presentation where is this video from, or with which I start. So my talk today focuses on 3 ideas born from my recent research. The first idea is that ideologies of limits and limitless growth are intertwined, perpetuating injustice in the name of progress. The second idea is that overdeveloped economies need to degrow if we are serious about global environmental justice. The third idea is that environmental and climate injustices are systemic features of capitalist growth. Now, by environmental justice, I mean a fair and equitable share of environmental goods and damages. Crucially, a fair share of the costs of climate change. That is, climate justice. By overdeveloped economies, I mean those that have used more than their fair share of the planet. By degrowth, I refer to a socially sustainable reduction in the production and consumption of environmentally damaging goods. I will illustrate my ideas today with empirical examples from agrarian change and urbanization, water and land conflict, and food production and climate adaptation, as well as with data from my macro work on ecological economics. I will conclude drawing links between my 3 arguments. So the first idea I want to talk about, limits and unlimited growth as 2 sides of the same coin. Let me start by a formative for me fieldwork experience. Mata de Pera is a small town a few kilometers north of our campus outside Barcelona. If you were to sit at the town square for a coffee, you would think you are in any other small Spanish village. Yet this is the town with the highest income in all of Spain. Walk off the square and you will find yourself in a Spanish Beverly Hills. Villas with high walls, angry dogs, swimming pools, and ceaseless sprinklers. I was there back in 2010, fresh in Barcelona, working with a team of conservation scientists and historians, studying water conflict and land use during Spain's civil war and Franco's dictatorship. We searched city archives and we collected oral histories from elders. And we documented with GIS and satellite images the conversion of what was an agrarian landscape into a leafy suburb. You can't really see the suburb on the right picture, but the white dots you see are the villas like the one in the picture I showed before. So our starting research question is, how did this happen? And what was the role of water in this process of what we called urbanizing the countryside? Landed elites, we found, privatized water after the Civil War, and by controlling water, they kicked peasants off common lands, parceling fields for real estate development. Franco's guns killed Republican and peasant alternatives and made possible an urbanization of the countryside that today seems natural, inevitable, and in some ways pastoral and peaceful. But here is how Madalena Font, a child at the time, a daughter of a peasant sharecropper, remembers the process. What struck me most during our research, though, was how this violence and injustice were erased from collective memory, even the memory of the victims, by a hegemonic story of progress. Progress defined as victory in a war against scarcity. Progress as synonymous to more and more water. Time and again, I found in the archives, elites sold the story of water being naturally limited, legitimating this way their projects of expansion while presenting themselves as saviors in a battle against a common enemy of scarcity. Yet Mata de Pera, with some 675 millimeters of rain each year, is not arid. Water, we argued in the paper, was scarce for real estate development, but this development was not natural nor necessary. It was a political and economic project. Elites told the story of natural limits, I came to realize, to justify their plans of unlimited urban growth. Since the 1970s, environmental debates are trapped in a supposed binary, Malthusians on the one hand, defending limits, against economists or eco-modernists defending growth. In my book Limits, published last year by Stanford University Press, I argue instead that limits to growth and unlimited growth are two sides of the same coin. Like Mata de Pera, a specter of limits constantly justifies capitalism's otherwise senseless and unjust pursuit of unlimited growth. Consider the myth of scarcity, the central foundation of mainstream economics. Our wants, economists tell us, are theoretically limitless. Therefore, the world is by definition limited. Don't worry though, we can always allocate resources efficiently, grow the economy, and satisfy more and more wants. And economists, of course, are the ones who are going to tell us how to do that. Turning the history of economic thought upside down, I show in my book how a first defense of unlimited growth in the name of limits is found in Malthus's infamous essay on population. Malthus is supposedly a prophet of limits and overpopulation. Read the essay, though, free of what you've heard, and you will be surprised. Malthus did not think that there are any limits to food, whose production, he wrote, may increase forever. I can't do a Malthus impersonation voice here, I'm sorry. No limits to commodities either. We can create them to as great quantities as we want, Malthus wrote. And a happy nation, for Malthus, is one whose population grows as close as possible to a geometric rate. That is Malthus, no? The prophet, the supposed prophet of overpopulation, wanting the population, if possible, to grow at the geometric rate. Economic models today assume that humans have unlimited wants, that we maximize consumption or utility in the discipline's jargon. Likewise, Malthus, the first professor of economics actually, assumed that our nature is to have children without limits, even if people around him, and for centuries, planned pretty well their families. Assuming, and that was the starting premise of his argument, that geometric population growth is natural and desirable, Malthus constructed a fantasy world, I argue, of eternal scarcity, one where, as he wrote, there is not enough for everyone to have a decent share. The poor, in this Malthusian fantasy world, are those who, by the nature of things, are left without a piece of the pie. Don't help them, Malthus warned. Only the fear of hunger pushes them to work hard and grow the pie for everyone. Increase the produce of the country, he wrote. Any other way of helping the poor will be cruel and tyrannical. We get some water from a huge water bottle here. Now, in the book, I argue that by turning capitalism's social production of scarcity into the natural state of things, economists, ever since Malthus, explain away the continuing presence of poverty amidst plenty. There is simply not enough, they tell us, not yet, not in Malthus' time, not in our times, 2 centuries after, and with economies several times bigger than they were at Malthus' time. In my book, I claim that paradoxically environmentalists, emphasizing the limitness of Earth, play the game of economists. If the world is limited, the natural response is what it has always been: escape and conquest, growth and colonization, geoengineering and landing in Mars. Think of the spacey Perth image that I used before, no? On the one hand, it was the moment that we supposedly realized that we live on one Earth, but symbolically, that was also the moment that we were escaping Earth, and the moment that our fantasies of escaping Earth were at their most powerful. Only when we own the choice of limits, I argue in the book, and stop attributing limits to stingy nature and the limited Earth or our unquenchable selves, will we really start sharing and finally living and having enough. Indeed, for radical environmentalists, from the Romantic movement, the harshest critics of Malthus at his time, to the anarcho-feminists of Emma Goldman, that I have the picture here, to the 1970s Greens, or to the degrowth movement today, limits are not an undesirable external imposition. They are a moral and political project that goes hand in hand with equality and justice. I call this in my book a project of collective self-limitation, society structured on an instinct of limit, not unlimited expansion. If our needs, our consumption, our reproduction can be limited, then scarcity is a myth. Everyone can and must have a decent share, because there is already enough. And it's interesting here to contrast, no? The cover of the magazine Emma Goldman was publishing to common images that we have now to talk about nature, no? Limited Earth, a limited planet. Look how Emma Goldman was instead emphasizing abundance. Abundance through simplicity, abundance through sharing. In my book, I read classical Greece. I'm Greek, by the way. So, you know, as Greeks, we are all trained since we are little kids to learn about our past and our mythology and not mythology of the past. I passed a big part of my childhood thinking I was Achilles. I didn't grow up to be that strong, unfortunately. I need to pick up again on my push-ups, maybe. I've read a lot on Greece as a child, but I had never studied Greece seriously. And that book I wrote on limits was an opportunity, because classical Greece, I found out, is one of the civilizations that took limits and self-limitation very seriously. Ancient Greeks were among the first to invent money, and definitely the first to live through the disasters of compound debt. They developed in response a moral philosophy of limitedness. Democracy, tragedy, and their ethic of moderation were all institutions of self-limitation, a culture of limits we so badly lack in our era of runaway global warming. A combination like that, not only of the Greeks, but of course of many other civilizations and of many other groups who live today, a combination of sufficiency and egalitarian sharing is what I understand as the imaginary of degrowth, living simply so that others may simply live. The roots of the tree of these ideas, not only in the name of degrowth, but affiliated ideas, extend to the economics of Gandhi and Kumarappa in India, Andean notions of vivir, Eastern or African philosophies. I see degrowth, therefore, as one among many keywords in a pluriverse of alternatives to a one-way future consisting only of growth. I'm passionate about degrowth, but let me put my ecological economist hat. I don't wear hats anymore, but you can imagine me now putting my ecological economist hat and defending degrowth with a less passionate language of numbers to avoid the charge of being a romantic and a utopian, which I take as compliments, actually. So let me move to the second idea, where I'm going to use a little bit more of graphs and numbers of overdeveloped economies must degrow. A recent study by my colleague and friend, Jason Hickel, finds that G8 nations are responsible for 85% of global CO2 emissions in excess of 350 ppms. Climatologists Alice Bowes-Larkin and Kevin Anderson calculate that high-income nations must reduce their emissions 10% every year in line with a fair share of a 2 degrees Celsius carbon budget. And yet, these same economies aspire to grow 2 to 3% every year, doubling every 20 years or so, 10 times bigger by the end of the century, straight into a ridiculous infinity. What you see here is a graph of global GDP growing 3% each year. Compare 2018 to 2100. Compound growth is the madness of economic reason, David Harvey wrote. I couldn't agree more. Maybe green growth then, increasing GDP while reducing resources and emissions? In a review of recent resource models, we find with Jason Hickel that in all scenarios, global resource use increases alongside GDP till 2050, as it has actually done till now, as you see in this graph. IPCC's climate models square growth with 1.5 degrees Celsius climate change only by assuming unproven and untested technologies of negative emissions, bioenergy with carbon capture that will take carbon out of the atmosphere. These are the yellow and brown parts of the graphs you see here. Tellingly, the only IPCC model that doesn't do that involves fast energy degrowth, and that's the first model you see, the P1. Some eco-modernists celebrate a supposed dematerialization of high-income countries, pointing to reductions in domestic resource use, the red lines in the graphs, alongside continued GDP growth, the blue lines. Yet this, we argued Jason Hickel, is an artifact of globalization. Look at material footprints, the green lines. That is the total resources used to produce the goods a country consumes, including imports. In a globalized economy, footprints are our best guide, and also global level data like the previous graph. Both of these increase hand in hand with GDP. Gladly, 21 countries, including UK, US, or France, have reduced their carbon footprints between 2000 and 2015, even though their economies grew. But the reductions were close to 1 to 2% at best per year, nowhere near the necessary 10% year after year that, as we saw, is necessary. And mind you, all these economies saw low GDP growth, close to 1% average each year since 2000. This is precisely why we call this period one of a secular stagnation. If growth were closer to the desired 3%, there would hardly be any reduction of emissions. If the global economy recovers from COVID the way it did in 2008, then we will overshoot 2-degree paths within a decade. According to scenarios we constructed with Slammersack and O'Neill, even an ambitious global mitigation plan, what we call a Green Deal, inspired by Europe's Green Deal, the yellow line in our graph, fails to keep global emissions within 2 degrees scenarios, the blue shaded area. The only recovery path that stays within the envelope of 2 degrees paths is the green line in the graph, a scenario that combines fast decarbonization, like in the Green Deal, reduced energy use, and crucially, zero GDP growth in the global north. Now, you may rightly ask, and that's the same questions that we ask, will lack of growth cause unemployment? How do we finance clean energy without growth? Will inequalities increase without growth? That's my research agenda on degrowth and on policies for degrowth. For example, with Nicholas Ashford from the MIT, we have showed how a reduction of working hours can indeed increase employment and leisure while reducing emissions. With Tilman Hartley and Jeroen van den Berg, my colleagues here in Barcelona, we assessed redistributive policies for increasing equality without growth. And there are many, from wealth taxes and maximum income limits to a universal basic income, or making workers shareholders of the companies they work for. The obstacle to the growth, of course, is not policies. It's not that we lack the ideas. I mean, these are unorthodox ideas. They are ideas that few people research, but we are not lacking ideas. What we lack are plausible or possible politics. How do we get these things done? No matter how ecologically necessary the growth might be, politically, it seems impossible. And we are not utopian in that sense. In our recent book, The Case for Degrowth, we particularly focus on that question. How could this happen? How could we move in a degrowth direction? We defend in the book a political strategy that articulates protest, conflict, reform, and prefiguration. We propose building new common senses, a concept we take from Antonio Gramsci, through cultural changes embodied and practiced in the making and in the defense through conflict of commons, articulated and generalized through political movements that promote such commons. With Viviana Sara, we studied exactly such transformative processes taking place in Barcelona. The city has a vibrant economy of commons where new senses of justice and sufficiency are practiced and diffused. The social movement of the city, coming together in the occupied squares in 2011, organized into a political party. Barcelona en Comú has been governing the city since 2015 with a remarkable agenda of social and environmental justice, including opening up public spaces, giving spaces to cooperatives, supporting an alternative economy. And that's a picture from the publicity campaign of the party. And in many ways, I find it funny because it speaks so much to our research that I was wondering whether they read our research, which of course is not the case. It's more that we are part of a whole culture here in the city that thinks along the same ways. And the advertisement plays with the word common, which is the name of the party, but also common sense. And it says that there is enough if we share what there is, and that this is a common sense, which was very much the common sense that I was trying to promote with my limits book. Let me now move to my last thesis, that environmental injustices are systemic features of capitalism. I will start again with an image from fieldwork. The Ceyhan River Plain in the southern coast of Turkey is a pastoral landscape, for most of the year though. Walk there in late spring and you will see people as far as your eyes can see, cramped in makeshift tents next to streams, waiting in long lines to use restrooms. Working 10 hours a day for $1 an hour till the dead heat of the summer, seasonal migrants of Kurdish origin from the eastern depths of Turkey harvest watermelons, making barely enough money to pass the winter with their families back home. My then student, Enterkan Turhan, traveled to Ceyhan and talked to workers under the suspicious eye of the local police. We were studying programs of the UNDP and the Turkish government to help ostensibly seasonal workers adapt to climate change. Extreme heat events cause more heat strokes every year, and diseases thrive in the makeshift settlements, while droughts threaten agriculture in the region. Adaptation included a cemented settlement for pre-made tents, where the seasonal workers could live, new bathrooms, and a charity clinic, where doctors checked workers daily for disease or heat stroke. Workers had also to register with IDs so that health authorities kept track of them. In our paper, published at Global Environmental Change, we argued that this is not adaptation, but maladaptation. Adaptation that increases the vulnerability of vulnerable people. The Turkish government is acting biopolitically. We used there a term by Michel Foucault. Its logic is one of controlling the circulation of people and commodities for the sake of capital and growth. Helping temporary farm workers adapt could be very easily, actually. Give them access to health and benefits available to normal workers. Remove intermediaries and let workers unionize and get decent pay. allow workers to settle if they want with their families in Saihan. None of this is allowed to happen. Because the goal, we argued in the paper, is not to help, but to keep a cheap, docile and mobile labor, healthy just enough to survive the heat and to work in the fields, coming for the growing season and swiftly leaving after, without settling, uninsured, paid below the minimum without complaining, and carefully monitored by the doctors too, in case there are any Kurdish agitators. The historical discrimination of ethnic Kurds meets here the logic of capital. Treating seasonal workers exceptionally maintains the prices of Turkey's watermelons low enough in order to be competitive in the cutthroat global market under conditions of climatic change. Capital is adapting to climate, we found. People not. Somewhat comparable is the situation in River Evrotas in southern Greece. We were there 6 years ago with Panagiotta Kotsila, studying why malaria, eradicated in Greece in the 1970s, made a comeback. Austerity cuts in mosquito control and the hotter climate caused an explosion of new cases. The government, though, blamed the epidemic on seasonal workers from Pakistan, who are there to pick oranges. Our in situ political ecology with Panagiotta revealed how underpaid seasonal workers who could not afford the exorbitant rents locals charged for a loom lived cramped with family in the marshes, in tents, where malaria mosquitoes thrived. Lack of access to hospitals and fear of deportation stopped workers from reporting symptoms. Seasonal workers remained invisible until malaria threatened Greece's tourism. Then the state, like in Turkey, targeted migrants biopolitically, othering them and framing the disease as an imported anomaly that should not worry tourists, while using the pretext of a health crisis to control the movements of workers even more tightly, making sure they pick oranges and then they go. This racialized othering that we observed in Greece, like we observed it in Turkey, was not only a matter of nationalist, fascist, xenophobic, racist mindsets. It was functional, we argued, to capital accumulation and growth. Racism is what keeps the labor of an exploited other cheap. In my 2018 book, Degrowth, I politicized what was otherwise an apolitical debate around limits to growth, within ecological economics at least. I showed how from its onset at the factories of Manchester and the plantations of the Americas, economic growth is predicated on the violent exploitation of cheap others, humans and non-humans. Racial, ethnic, and gender hierarchies secure an unpaid or underpaid labor force from which surplus is extracted. Surplus invested to make more surplus. Economic growth, in other words. The role of undervalued care labor, mostly by women, is crucial in my story. I follow in my work Silvia Federici, who showed how separating women from the control of their bodies was as crucial for capital's original accumulation as was the separation of laborers from their commons. And interestingly, Federici was writing precisely for the period that also Malthus started writing at. And while Malthus was attributing the growing numbers of people to overpopulation and helping the poor, Federici has showed how it was actually an attack on the rights of women who up to had their own ways of family planning. It was an attack precisely by the forces and interests of incipient capital, which lacked the excess labor force that would make production cheap enough in order to be competitive and to expand. Let me close here by weaving connections between the different parts of my research that I presented here. If we want to understand social and environmental injustices in the food chain, for example, like the ones I presented here, or any other commodity chain, from minerals to tree plantations, we have to focus on the systemic force that demands the cheapening of people and their environments. This force has a name: capitalism. And the cause of the cheapening is the inexorable need of capital to grow without limit, 3% per year, all the way to an impossible infinity. Growth in the short term is only possible by shifting costs to racialized others, out of view or to the future. To this impossible goal of compound growth, more and more is sacrificed: our commons, our public health and education systems that we built with so much effort and pain, the very well-being of our planet and of our descendants. To think of escape routes, we need to start by looking at the actual people fighting to limit capital and to limit growth. Those who struggle to block mines and oil pipelines. Those who work for food sovereignty or peasant agriculture. Those who reclaim the commons of their cities, occupying squares. And we have to think carefully how these disparate fights can be connected into a broader social and political movement that finally brings social, environmental, and climate justice. A movement for an environmentalism of the commons. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Georgos, for that fascinating presentation. So I would like to remind everyone, if you have questions for Georgos, and I'm sure just like me, you're still trying to process what you just heard, please put them in the 14th keynote channel, and then I'll call on you to read them out aloud, and then we can have a nice live discussion. I see in the channel that Stephen already has a question there. Stephen, would you please read it out to Georgos?
Sure. Thank you so much, Georgos, for the excellent talk. A lot of really, really provocative ideas and interesting thing to bite into. And I really like this phrase, the project of collective self-limitation that you mentioned. And I don't know if I'm framing this the right way, but how do you think those projects ought to begin? At what scale, or how do they, maybe you have some examples or something where a project of that kind sort of takes off? If it's a movement, of course, that's one thing, but I just wonder how we might think about that in sort of launching these projects. What sort of catalyzes them, and in what sort of ways might they be best carried out?
Yeah, to link here to my work on degrowth, where I think in the recent book, The Case for Degrowth, we are a little bit more directly asking that question. In my limits book, I'm just trying to show that there is a need for a culture of limits and for what I call collective self-limitation, particularly in our times. And I'm trying to show that there has always been this demand. No, it's not something new. There has always been, with ups and downs, but it's always there. And I guess for those of you in Japan, no, a lot of the traditional philosophy and the Eastern philosophy there exactly expresses this type of might say it also desire or wisdom, no? So that was my first argument. In the case 4, we're trying to think a little bit more the question you are saying, okay, how does this happen? And the argument we make there that it's not something to start ex nihilo from zero. No, it's not that it doesn't exist, but it's rather, it asks from us analysts, attention to what is already going on. So in the book, we're trying to say that this common sense of self-limitation is around. It's not dead. It's not at its best, let's say, within capitalism, but it is around, no? And there is a common sense that not only that we have to limit ourselves, but also that a good life is a life lived within reasonable limits. No, it's not a life of total expansion. It's not the life of, I don't know, the Wolf of Wall Street, for whoever has seen this movie, that it's a life lived without limits up to the final destruction, which I think kind of captures a little bit the gist of our civilization. So we argue that there are people, and there are famous people, but there are also common people, that express this desire. So one is we have the desire, and we have the people, not dominant, but it's there. Not dominant because there aren't the structures to be expressed. So on the second level, on the communal level, so we have the personal level. Then on the communal level, we see that there have been always alternative or communities economies, as the scholars Gibson Graham have called them, communities economies or diverse economies. There have always been, and they are proliferating at a small scale currently. So to think about urban food gardens, for example, it is a project that, in a sense, represents both commoning, sharing, and a sense of collective self-limitation. The urban food gardens are not huge projects that they want to expand more and more and supply, I don't know, make money and supply the whole city and then export to the rest of the world. No, there are projects that they have a logic of sufficiency in them. So we have also the communal projects. So then the final part of the puzzle, not an easy one, but the one I was pointing to, is like how these common senses of people, how the projects that they're emerging can become something bigger, something more universal, because if they're just to remain pockets of here and there, we don't go anywhere, So then is the question of political organizing and political movements. So the question is how these small commons and how the people that they see themselves as part of these commons can organize to something bigger that can create the structures so these common senses can be expressed, so that we can live without limits and we are not forced to work harder and harder. For us academics, publish more and more, because it's not only capitalists that we are trying to make more money, like this logic of capital is prevalent to all of us, in our everyday,
Yeah, no, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. I see we have another question from Ilan. Ilan, would you like to ask it directly?
Unmute. There we go. Okay, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Great. Let's see. I don't know how to do the video at the moment, but that's okay. Thank you for a wonderful, very stimulating and very insightful talk. There's an awful lot of material to digest and to think about, but I'd like to try to follow up on one piece, one comment you made near the end, which I thought was quite important in the idea of linking what I understood to be disparate groups or movements towards degrowth. And my question is whether there are means and particularly narratives in different communities. I mean, they may not be the same narrative, but that are specific to different communities, that resonate in different communities to reinforce the ideas of degrowth and to engender movement in that direction in those communities. In other words, what can we think about as means of linking these social identities and visions for degrowth that could lead to this kind of collective change?
Thank you. That's a good question. First of all, just to clarify, so yes, I don't see these different movements necessarily mobilized or mobilizing the word degrowth per se. So I see degrowth as a term that makes sense analytically and politically from a higher level to understand what is necessary and where we should be going. But I don't mean to say that different groups should find connections through the word or the narrative of degrowth per se. So I think you also assumed that in your question, but I just want to make it clear because it's not always clear. and sometimes people might think that the goal should be to pursue a political or social movement project in the name of degrowth. So I don't think that is necessary, as there has never been a movement or a political movement in the name of economic growth, but economic growth has been like a prevalent idea, no? That an imaginary that has led a lot of other actions. So I would see degrowth as an equivalent imaginary in an ecological direction. Now, what are the other narratives? I think interestingly, these narratives are already there, and I could have put more pictures from the publicity campaign of Barcelona en Comú, Barcelona en Common, which is a political party here that, as I said, governs the city of Barcelona. But a lot of the slogans they put in their recent publicity campaign, which they call it, they gave the name to their publicity campaign, common sense, no? Or sense of the common. So they played with this double meaning of common sense, no? A lot of the slogans they put there, I think, I don't know how it happened. I mean, it would be interesting to ask how they got these slogans, but I think there are slogans that came out from the movements in the city, because these parties, people that are directly involved in the movements of the city. So a lot of the slogans are the kind of narratives you are talking about, at least for a place like Barcelona or South Europe. I mean, its place also has its own narratives of common senses. So I'm not sure if in Japan is the same common senses as in Barcelona. Probably there are, and probably there are differences. But for example, the main common sense that I showed, and it's also one that I'm trying to promote with my work intellectually to show that it's logical, is the one that it's we already have enough if only we shared, and or if we share, we're gonna have enough. You can see it both ways now, and this is a common sense that I think the common sense of sharing is one that can provide a collective narrative. The common sense of commons, of coming together and doing things together, and knowing that we thrive best as humans when we cooperate and do things together, but also that in doing that, we also have to set our rules and our limitations for how to work as a collective. So the common sense of commons is another one that can bring people together. And the common sense of another keyword that I emphasized in my presentation, of justice and of the current injustice. But to understand that the current injustice, which is economic, most people understand the current injustice as economic. No, that we will read, no, that Elon Musk and those who have money in the stock exchange have become like 10 times richer during the crisis, while the majority of us suffer. No, there is a sense of economic justice, and social injustice, but linking that also to environmental injustice, because these three things are together. So I think around narratives of justice, sharing, and commons, many different movements, progressive movements can come together and create a bigger narrative, which I think goes in the direction of what I'm talking about here.
Thank you very much. That I didn't mean that it should be explicitly degrowth, but I think you've answered it very effectively and given me some very helpful things to think about further. Thank you.
Thank you. I think looking at the clock, we have time for one more question. Flusara Koyu-san, would you like to ask it directly, please?
Can I speak?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very interesting and very important. What's very important is what's the strategy? This our world is a capitalism society, especially global capitalism is very important, strong structure now. How to control or how to, some resistance will happen, Barcelona or some regional area, but how to control this capitalistic society? Do you have any strategy or, and also what's the design of degrowth economy system? This is what's the market economy including or control market economy? What kind of design of a new economic system? if you can
yes,
any
thank you.
information. Thank you.
No, there are two huge questions, of course. It's the type of questions that we tried to answer in the last book, but it's a short book, so I don't know to what extent we deal with them convincingly. Let me start with the second one, the engine. I don't think we can prescribe exactly the engine of what it should look like, because like the world is so complex, and it's and even if we were to prescribe it, it wouldn't make any difference in the sense that the world evolves, no, and it doesn't evolve according to blueprints. But we can think a little bit of, yes, how would it be different? So in the book, what we are articulating is that in the current market economy, it's not just market economies, no? So we have market economies, we have regulation. There's no market economy without regulation, right? And there are also the diverse economies that Gibson Graham talks about. There are all these things that they're happening, and they're important for the economy. They are taking place outside of the market relations. There are the support that takes place within households. There are the commons. There are a lot of uncommodified spaces still, no? So there are these three areas, let's say the market, the state, the regulation, and the commons. Right now, the emphasis is on the market, is on private corporations, on production for profit. Most of production and most of our productive time is directed in this sphere. Regulation is a sphere that has shrunk the last years. I'm generalizing, but all over the world it has kind of shrunk. There is deregulation, was the movement for deregulation, and the commons remains a small part of the whole thing. Remains always on the margin, a sphere of social innovation, a sphere of social support, but not really the majority of the economy going there. Although a lot of the time is going to this uncommodified part of the economy, but remains invisible and undervalued. What we are arguing in the book, that's general, but I think it gives the direction, is an inversion of this order. So we're talking about the commons becoming the big part of the picture. So a lot of production being produced in common and for the commons, in cooperatives, for example, like cooperatives becoming the dominant form of organization and not producing for profit, but producing for the well-being of the workers and their users. So the cooperative form of production becoming the dominant form of production, regulation taking up a bigger role than it used to have, and the state in coordinating things, and the market economy shrinking to the degree that it's necessary. So one wouldn't have to be against private restaurants, for example, nor production for the market of certain things like that, but one would be against the privatization of energy, or the privatization of water, or the privatization of public infrastructure. So certain things can remain private and produced not for profit, but for the sustenance of those who produce, and the market economy continue to operate, but in a restraint and in a sphere where it's not putting in peril through its constant expansion the planet and the rest of the system. So an inversion of priorities is how we imagine the economy. In terms of strategy, I would go back to what I said, but I know that it's not satisfactory, my answer. So we have to recognize that whoever tries now to give a strategy of overcoming a globalized capitalism is necessarily inadequate, the answer, because we understand that the current system is very powerful, has evolved over 300 years. There are a lot of path dependencies. So to claim that there is a political strategy that we could escape capitalism in whatever way, revolutionary or not revolutionary, whatever way someone postulates right now, has a degree of impossibility, no? But if we really think that we need the growth and that capitalism is bound on growth, we have to seriously think of how could this plausibly happen. And you might argue that the story we put down in terms of strategy is not plausible. So the strategy we put is the one I outlined very quickly in my presentation, and we outline a little bit more detail in the book. And it's one from starting from rooted everyday changes, producing differently for the commons, organizing politically to turn a bigger movement into the commons, and articulating these movements into positions of political power and state power in different countries, hopefully by starting in the most powerful countries. Now, this is going to be slow. This doesn't seem like being immediate. But the question is that the conditions constantly change. I mean, we wouldn't expect to be where we are if we had this conference 1 year ago, no? The world has changed dramatically within a year, and the world is going to change dramatically because of climate change within the next 10 years. We know that. The question is like what opportunities there are there for different organizing to come. And I think we should remain optimistic that there will be these opportunities, although we have to remain also realistic and alert on the much greater possibilities for even more dangerous paths than the one we are now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So, Georgos, I see that there are a lot of questions for you waiting in the channel. So maybe after you've had a second coffee or so, it would be lovely if you could take the time and have a look at the Slack channel and see if you have some answers for the many questions that are still rolling in. Thank you again for joining our live session this early in the morning and for joining our symposium with the wonderful keynote. And with that, I'd like us to move into a short break. Quick note, after the break, we will do the Q&A for the keynote from yesterday. So if you have any questions from Arnim Week and his talk from yesterday, please put them in the 13th keynote channel, and then we'll pick them up from there. Let's see, at 16:05 Japanese time. That's in roughly 10 minutes. Okay, thanks for joining, and then see you again in 10 minutes. Okay, welcome back everyone from the break. We're now in the section for today where we will do the keynote question answer for yesterday's keynote by Arnim Week. I see Arnim Week has joined us. And first, a big thank you to Arnim, because Arnim has already answered a lot of questions in the channel. And so first, I've heard that a person who has already asked the question yesterday has another question. Hein, would you please ask your second question?
Yes, well, Arnim, this is Hein Malay from RIHN. Thank you for answering the question about transition theory and how that relates to your framework. I was also, I liked the emphasis on sort of not focusing on problems, but instead looking at solutions and sort of things that are already going on. At the same time, I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little bit more on the idea of solutions, because they ultimately sound as though, you know, problems can be solved, and therefore it's very applicable to your first level of sort of relatively small scale activities. But to think of solutions in terms of regime change, etc., seems you know, a much bigger task. So I was just wondering what your thought about why you came to use that term in particular.
Great question. Thank you. Yeah, I think, you know, it was mostly strategic reasons for picking solutions. It's short and dense, and you know, so that was the main reason to start from. But what you're referring to is obviously very important, right? These are not simplistic quick fixes we're after, right? I mean, even on the micro scale, as we're working with various actors, in my case particularly with businesses in the food system or the food economy, it becomes, you know, instantly clear that it's not just an introduction of, you know, a couple of solar panels that will not get us anywhere, right? So what we are after are very complex constellations and processes that have, you know, little resemblance with quick technological fixes, let's put it this way, right? So what we're looking at are changes of practices and policies linked to technologies, linked to, you know, new financial instruments, value changes, and so on. And so I really appreciated that you brought that up yesterday in the Slack channel, the link to transition theory, because it's it's a more profound framing of saying what, you know, the transformations or transitions we are looking at, and the solutions that can contribute to this are, you know, very complex constellations, multifactorial, and we need to not just focus on one particular element that can, you know, fix the problem.
Thank you. Another question that came up was, I think you mentioned a framework piece. Could you show us what you're working on there, or tell us what you're working on there a bit more?
Sure. Yeah, so that was, I mentioned it in the keynote briefly. So what I tried to do for my lab's work, and there were several questions about, you know, how these solutions were selected and so on. So just to make that clear, I thought I'm you know, best positioned to talk about, you know, what we have been working on the last several years, and I tried to illustrate this initial framework with the two axes that can help us to structure solutions for sustainable food systems. I try to illustrate this with the projects of my lab, but it can be obviously, you know, used for all sorts of other projects. And with this, you know, with this in mind, I try to apply it to the presentations of the symposium. So I basically just, you know, read the abstract and tried to figure out, you know, and try to standardize obviously a little bit in the language. But if I can share my screen here, I can quickly show you what that looks like at the moment. I mean, this is really, it's not very sophisticated, and I apologize. We have about, I think I went through 95% of the abstracts, not quite all of them. But what I was really amazed by, and I think this really speaks to Stephen and the team's effort, it's amazing to see so much work on solutions, right? To see so much work that moves in the direction of better understanding how do we make these transitions, how do we make these transformations. So just to describe briefly the map and maybe, you know, highlight a couple of examples there. So what I was proposing is that there are, you know, solutions, or to speak to RIHN, you know, various forms of transition and transformation processes towards sustainable food systems on 3 levels. Very traditionally, you know, the micro level that really focuses on individual actors or groups, the food subsystems where we have definitely at least one major relationship. Lots of work goes into the question of, you know, how policies, for instance, influence consumers or farmers, right? So this is at least, you know, this kind of 2+ actors level, and then the macro level of, you know, multiple complex alternative food networks, food economies, and so forth. And then I suggested 3 different types of solutions. One that primarily studies solutions, tries to evaluate them, good share of contributions in this symposium on that. The second is not so much just studying the solutions, but trying to use the evidence from those solutions to transfer and adapt those solutions to other cases. There are a number of examples here as well. And the third one was the supporting the creation of new solutions through research. And there also, usually we associate this with experiments, and there we have a good share of examples as well. Yeah, so I mean, you know, it's always a little bit artificial, right? Now you see a fully populated map and you think, oh, wow, yeah, okay, the inventor of the framework, you can demonstrate that it works, right? That, you know, the different contributions nicely distribute over those 9 cells. But what I want to say with this is, the 9 cells, that this is what I'm referring to. What I see though is that we have really a nice variance and nice spectrum, right, of contributions. And I might not have gotten them all right? Sometimes, you know, abstracts were very short, or I couldn't quite extract all the relevant information. But I think the benefit of such a framework and such a mapping is to spark conversations within cells and beyond. And when I think about, I haven't checked that, right? But you guys have tried to structure the symposium in a particular way, right? And so you have the different sessions, right? And they might or might not align with this logic. So that logic basically just offers another stream of conversations we could have, as I say, within the cells, across the cells, in one line, in one column, that I think would be very productive, because I still feel this is all, quite novel, and the more community support we can get, the better it is, I feel.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one quick question from Daniel, who has a follow-up question, I think, to his one posted in the channel. Daniel, are you there?
Ooh, yes, okay, I'm here. Thanks very much. Yes, I'm Daniel Niles. I'm based here also in Kyoto, and I asked a question yesterday on the Slack, and I received a reply, so thank you very much for that. And I think I have a slightly different question, but it touches on the first. The first question was really about, in your learning experiences for sustainability, and in your general approach, this focus on the already existing opportunities and examples which are out there. And I think that's really important. We heard more about that today, the need for to move away from the kind of, we can say, the conventional framings of a lot of these food systems or land-based problems, and start thinking, looking to other fields for valuable experience. And so I really appreciated very much your learning experiences, and in particular, you mentioned the action plans that you develop with communities, and I thought that was really interesting and really important. And I wonder if you'd say a little bit more about that, and if I can just kind of tag on to my question from yesterday about, okay, yes, we focus on, when communities are thinking about where they are and where they want to go. You do have to engage with the kind of entrenched macro structures, we can say, that we were just listening to in the first presentation, or in the second keynote today. And I wonder if you begin to address those types of phenomena in your action plan. And thanks very much.
Yeah, so that's a really complex and relevant questions, and various nuances in there too. So maybe a couple of different things. The action plans we developed were really on different levels when it comes, for instance, to the support of the grain economy in Arizona, and especially its sustainable version. I think we are currently in the process to working with maltsters and farmers and craft brewers on some action plans, how to build that further out. And to your point of how far do we actually account in this for macro conditions, context conditions, influencing factors through the state policies and investment opportunities. We definitely do, right? We take usually a somewhat simplistic sustainable entrepreneurial ecosystem approach to it. So we have 5-6 different factors we scan for, and then look into in how far shifts in that direction need to be accounted for as well. And some of them are much harder to accomplish, but some of them, when it comes to food policies in Arizona, for instance, there was a good share of movement in the past several years based on some of those action plans and initiatives that we have been part of. So I think we cannot too optimistically think that context conditions can be completely changed, but I also feel we should not just give in and say it all needs to limit activities to the immediate actors. I just wanted to one quick follow up on the learning and the capacity building, because that was really the starting point. We try to involve students and practitioners and stakeholders into building these action plans for both. On the one hand side, to build the action plans and move forward on transitioning and transforming the food system and the food economy, but in particular for capacity building. So I just finished a course on the craft brewing and grain economy in Arizona with 10 graduate students, and they were part of some of this action plan development. And it's critical. I mean, if we limit it really just to the studying of existing solutions and visiting them and you know, making them tangible through experience, that's all great. But that again doesn't necessarily translate into how do you know, graduates now really participate in developing new solutions, right? So these kind of action-oriented courses that you know, allow us with practitioners to develop these plans, it's very beneficial for the students to do that. And again, I'm happy to share material if you're interested in more of the details.
Thank you so much, Arnim. So with that, I'd like to conclude the question and answer session for the keynote from the first day. Thanks again, Arnim, for coming on today on a different day for your keynote. And thanks also for taking the time to answer all the questions on Slack. I think this has worked really well. And I believe there are also more questions coming in, actually. So if you still have the time and energy for that, it would be lovely if you could have another look there. Thanks so much again for joining.
Will do. Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so with that, I would like to move on to the, well, I guess the second big part of our symposium for today, the second session of the symposium, where we will look at food futures, transdisciplinary processes, and politics. And today we will have 5 different presentations. The first will be by Joost Verwoerd, looking at using gaming to develop public capacities for anticipatory governance. The second will be by José Luis Vivero Pol, who will look at commodity, commons, public good, or human right. Normative food narratives shape future food transitions. Then we will hear from Akitsu Motoki-san, who will talk about grappling at food policy in Kyoto, experiences and future prospects. Then Astrid Magnus will talk about evaluating futures for food system change, from imagination to transformation. And finally, Kanang Kantama Turapoi will look at constructing practice-oriented participatory policy for sustainable everyday urban food futures in Bangkok. So as you can see, we have an exciting time ahead of us. Let's get started with the first presentation by Joost Verwoerd.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Joost Verwoerd. I'm a researcher at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University. And I'll be talking today about using gaming to develop public capacities for anticipatory governance. And I'll be talking about this in a food systems context. So first of all, I think we're all profoundly aware that we're living in a time of great transformation. Things are changing very rapidly. And to use the words of University of Toronto professor John Robinson, there are no non-transformative futures. All futures are transformative. It just depends on whether we're actually heading somewhere that is good for all involved. So that's really the challenge. And imagination plays an important part in this because, as Amitav Ghosh says, we have a crisis of the imagination on our hands. It's often very hard for people to imagine any alternative outside of the current sort of like hyper-capitalist thinking about development and growth. And this is really something that needs to be tackled at a deep level. And often when people think about the future, one of the key problems there as well is that we live in a sort of consensus reality where people say, well, obviously the present is the present. Sort of powerful actors say, this is the present. Obviously, everybody agrees. The past is like this, and the future can only be, it's maybe some uncertainty associated with the future, but within those bounds of uncertainty, we sort of know what's going to happen, right? and to sort of pretend that there is consensus about this. In actuality, people live in multiple presents. They live in multiple worlds, right? Multiple present realities. There are multiple pasts that people are connected to. And if we can sort of be aware of this and work with this reality, then that opens up the future massively, right? Because if we can acknowledge that people are living in different realities with different pasts, then there are also different sets of futures associated with each of these different realities, which can be combined, connected, explored in different directions, and so on. So why do we want to talk about game design in this context? Well, when we think about the value of exploring multiple worlds, games are uniquely powerful because they allow us to really create entire worlds, whether we're talking about digital or analog games or some kind of hybrid. And they allow us to step into new roles that are associated with these worlds. So we really can become new people, different people, take future perspectives. There's work at RIHN that focuses on future generations, which really fits with this very well. New rules, we can explore new forms of governance, new ways of working together and see how we relate to that. And finally, also new capacities. So what capacities do we need and do we develop when we engage with the world in a different way? So this is a really exciting space to explore, but most of the work so far in the sort of food systems and sustainability space happens very much on what is called applied games or serious games. So these are games that are sort of used much like a serious game or much like a scenario or a modeling approach would be used, or some other participatory process as a sort of alternative to explore in-depth decision-making problems and participation problems, which is of course wonderful. But at the same time, there's this massive commercial world of games out there, which it's arguably the biggest form of media at the moment and has been for some time. And so to connect these two worlds, the worlds of sort of applied serious gaming and societal games, is going to be really valuable. And there are many different bridges to be made. So one of them is through thinking about futures literacy. How well are people able to kind of discern and create different futures and work with them to make new things come to life and become realities. And that could be, we could be looking at educational context, informal learning context, etc. Another side to the story could be social and political capital. So the whole ecosystems and the online culture that exists around games, especially when you think about commercial games, is a really interesting space to explore. And I will show you some examples of games that sort of hit various parts of this. But first, just say that if we look at the sort of diversity of futures that are explored in commercial games, this is work by Marion Berends. The imaginations are quite limited. Lots of these futures are sort of like mainstream dystopian stories, especially in the bigger games, the AAA, sort of big scale commercial games. It's a lot about a hero in a sort of standard dystopian world. In independent games or indie games, it's a little bit more diverse, and there's a little bit more space for other types of futures, but it's still quite limited. And we can look at the roles of developers, incentives for these developers, the audience they engage with, and the influences of other media to help understand why this is the case and how we can break open this space. And one way to break open this sort of relatively limited space for game development is through game jams. So we have a lot of experience with this. So game jams are basically brainstorming events where people create games rather rapidly over a week, for instance, and then maybe working on it a little bit later as a way to explore various issues in new game formats and to come up with new game prototypes. And this is wonderful because if you make many games, each of these games can represent a different future, and people can be learning together by making new game worlds. So I just want to show you a few examples from a sort of food systems context from recent game jamming work. So We made a bunch of games, our students made a bunch of games with our guidance for the CGIAR, Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security program. And the games were all focusing on gender relations and gender issues and challenges, and youth in an agriculture and food security context. And one of the games that was developed, which is a wonderful game, is called Harm to Table. This is a game where you play a smallholder farmer in the global south, in a global south context, and the other player plays a consumer, and you see how the consumer behavior interacts with the life of the farmer. So it's very much a sort of food systems, different life worlds kind of game, and it's a multiplayer game where people they're playing the game locally, so they can talk a lot together, just sort of face to face about what they're doing in the game and how the different choices that they're making are influencing the other person's life. Second game is an analog game with some digital support called Sustainabuild, which is a game that's currently being developed with people in Kenya, and it's meant for communities, rural communities, who are exploring different adaptation options when it comes to climate change and sort of collective action questions. Another game which is meant more for the sort of commercial market is a game about climate challenges and adaptation and migration, also being developed with people from, in this case, the Horn of Africa. And it's more of a story-driven game and seeing how different capacities impact different story elements in the game. And then finally, another very interesting game, sort of prototype, was Tenalp, which was a game that takes a multi-species approach where you can play various parts of a sort of farm environment, all these animals and plants, and even at some point things like laws and money. You can take these perspectives to understand sort of the life world of a smallholder farmer. And you know, the life worlds concept is something that the Feast project has also worked with. So it's connecting systems, life worlds, and practices in these kinds of games, which is really wonderful to see. Beyond these sort of prototypes that explore different game ideas, we've also been working on more fully fledged games. So this is an example called Utrecht 2040, which is a game developed for all students at Utrecht University across the entire university, for them to sort of get acquainted with sustainability challenges. And Astrid is also involved in the development of this game. And this game is really built to, it's a location-based game. So people go out on the streets and they get assignments to reimagine, in this case, the city of Utrecht in 2040, and really think about what needs to change. And they do lots of assignments. You can obviously see this is before Corona, right? But it can be played in Corona times as well with smaller teams or individuals, and it's all taking place outside. But people engage publics and do all kinds of missions to sort of reimagine the city. And the activities that they're doing and the documentation of that is spread out all across the city map while they're walking around with their mobile phones. And they can see each other's work in a sort of social media format. And the result is a sort of alternate reality layer of a future Utrecht that's slowly starting to cover the entire city. And this game can be played with thousands of people. So that's really exciting. And Astrid will tell a little bit more about the work that we've done with the Feast team around games, connecting games to other foresight methods, working on a food policy council. But that's very much part of this sort of stream of thinking as well. And sort of inspired by the Utrecht 2040 game, and also to some extent by the game that Astrid will be talking about, we are developing a new mobile game based on a project called Seeds of Good Anthropocenes, which is a global research project that focuses on bringing together all kinds of local radical innovations that people are doing all around the world, and thinking about how these could be combined into big transformation pathways. We're building a digital game where people combine these local innovations into these pathways as well. In this game, we will focus initially on East Africa and then be rolled out. And the images you see here are from Southern Africa, where a lot of this seeds work has been done. And so just to sort of use that sort of scenario thinking, transformation pathway thinking in a gamified format with lots of people is the goal of this game development. So you see that these games all have sort of aspects of what we're talking about here, with the sort of interaction between applied games and commercial games, but there's still more to explore in the sort of larger cultural space. So I want to talk about that very briefly, because games can really be a cultural force, and there are things happening that should be taken into account in that regard. So for instance, a very intimidating example of this is that many game designers are looking at the conspiracy theory movement QAnon as a sort of like alternate reality game, complete with sort of dungeon masters that come up with cryptical information that people are then deciphering, and they're then doing sort of like all these things out there to work out what all of this means and what the conspiracy is doing. And you know, a bunch of these people were involved in the White House, in the Capitol coup this week, which kind of shows how deep the alternate reality really goes in this case. It's very interesting to look at, obviously quite disconcerting as well. A more benign example, perhaps, depending on your political leanings, is that many young political figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are streaming online gaming, and they're using it to connect to new audiences and also to some degree to talk about politics while this streaming is happening, and that's, you know, getting a lot of attention. Really stepping into that sort of game streaming world that has become very popular. Another example, more of a sort of like normal game example, you could say, is the fantastic role-playing game Disco Elysium, an award-winning game which comments very concretely on the challenges of dealing with different political systems, and actually features a lot of people who are involved in political activism as people who are, for instance, doing voice acting in these games. So this space of engaging with gamified cultural change and the role of games in cultural change is becoming quite extensive and multidimensional, which is really interesting to look at. So thank you very much. So all the student games can be found at hitch.io/jam/sustainability-jam 2020. I hope you have a great conference, and just send me an email if you want to know more about any of this. Thank you very much.
Okay, a big thanks to Joost for this fascinating presentation. I think there's lots to explore in games, and there are lots of interesting games around food futures out there. And who knows what kind of future games we'll see in that direction as well. As before, as yesterday, if you have any questions for Joost, please write them in the channel. It's going to be the channel for this session, which is, let me check, which is 14th session 2, Futures TD Policy. And we'll gather all the questions there and then address them in the Q&A session at the end of this session. So next up, we have the presentation by Jose Luis Vivero-Pol on commodity, commons, public good, or human right. Normative food narratives shape future food transitions. Let's take it away.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are watching this session, and welcome to my session in this symposium on transitioning cultures of everyday food consumption and production. And I apologize for reading, but I've been trying hard this afternoon to retain the name of the symposium, but it has been impossible. It has been impossible. Especially welcome to this session on post-growth food systems and politics, that I think that is very relevant to start discussing those things now. So first, and just before I enter in my presentation, I would like to thank Professors Takae Kataoga, Yasunari Tsetsugo, and Stephen McGreevy for inviting me as a speaker to this symposium. So now, just allow me to share the screen with my presentation, because this is my third try. I did it before. I've already been trying 3 times before. And in the good one, I didn't share the presentation. So I don't want to make the same mistake. Now that as you have seen, I'm going to be fast, and probably the slides are very many, and I will let the whole presentation for you to review and to read or to understand better some of the things that I'm going to say fast, because I have now just less than perhaps 30 minutes. My presentation will be about the normative valuation of food, either as a commons or a commodity. In commons, I will also include the idea of food as a public good or as a human right, and how those normative valuations of food are extremely relevant because they shape policy options. They shape preferences, and they shape discarded policy options. So just let's start. Food has multiple meanings. That's an obvious thing, very commonsensical. And the meanings are situated in place, time, and depending on the eye of the beholder. That's why those meanings are phenomenological. So food, it can be different things for different people. It's not only one meaning that prevails. And I'm going to explore the explanatory power of the idea of food as a commodity, the dominant one in the current global food system, and compare with a growing one, an emerging alternative valuation of food as a commons. And by commons, and it's important to emphasize also because there are several schools of thought on commons and commoning. By commons, I understand a social construct in the way to govern resources, a resource by a community, the way of governing and institutionalizing governing mechanism for specific resources by a community, doing things together, that's called the commoning, with a purpose. They do something for something. And why is that? Because that resource in principle is essential for the entire community. That's why they devise this governing mechanism. And what I'm going to do, as I said, is that I'm going to contrast the explanatory power and the importance of the social construct of food as a commodity, dominant narrative in the industrial food system. Food is a commodity, therefore is ontological and not phenomenological, and therefore as a commodity, the best allocation mechanism is through the market. But what I'm going to defend is that this ontological social construction and food, it's basically driving the earth beyond the planetary limits. Is basically destroying the earth because of the greed of the industrial food corporations to maximize profit using resources at any cost. And actually, it's not just my approach. There is a growing consensus by different panels and multi-author documents by the UN and beyond and other institutions, saying that the current way of producing and eating food, mostly based on Western diets and industrial food production, is unsustainable. So the business as usual is no longer an option. My research hypothesis, the hypothesis that I was using during my PhD that was finalized 3 years ago, and it says that the foundation of this presentation is that the way we value food, the narrative of food, conditions the set of policies, governing mechanisms, and legal frameworks that can be proposed in the transition pathways towards more sustainable and fairer food systems for all. So very quickly, I mean, the research pathway is structured into 3 domains. The first one is that how did we reach the current situation where food as a commodity dominates over food as a commons? and how this narrative was pretty much informed and sustained by the academia. The second one, how those narratives influence policy options with a case study of food-related professionals, and how those narratives influence legal frameworks and governmental positions, using a case study with the US and the EU on the right to food in the SDGs, in the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, I will end up this presentation with very quick theoretical underpinnings of my approach to food as a commons. That it's a normative approach, but it's not just based on theory, but also based in customary and contemporary food experiences. I'm sorry, what happens? Okay. That's it. I will be using discourse analysis because I will be focusing my intervention in narratives of food. Narratives understood as a set of coherent assumptions and principles to communicate a worldview, in this case, a worldview related to food, and narratives and frames understood as cognitive devices to define a problem, first, define the current problems of the global food system, define causal relationships between the problems and the main drivers and the outputs or the undesirable outputs, and the proposed solutions. Proposed solutions that are those that are feasible, accepted, legitimate by considering accepted and legitimate by a given group, and those options that are not accepted or are naive, or they are considered as non-feasible or non-doable by different reasons. So framings and the narratives are very important because they define the possible and feasible options and the discarded and non-feasible options, because there is a moral valuation in every framing or in every narrative. So how have we reached the current situation? Well, the economists, they are pretty much guilty on that, because the way of approaching to commons or to goods in general, it was based on just two features, rivalry and excludability, and apologies because there are some things that prevents you to read properly, but based on excludability and rivalry, they define four clusters of goods. Positioning common pool resources, the commons, in those goods that are highly rival, but at the same time difficult to exclude. Those common pool resources that were thoroughly studied by Elinor Ostrom and her colleagues. But this approach, the economic approach to goods, it's highly reductionist, only based on two features, only two things. It's highly theoretical because there are many exceptions that they don't fulfill their considerations. And on top of that is ontological. They define what goods are. Not how goods are valued or perceived or considered, no, how goods are. So I was trying to debunk this approach. So first, I had to do this research, systematic research through Google with using the PRISMA guidelines between 1900 and 2016, analyzing all the different academic literature that was including the idea of food as a commons, food as a public good, food as a private good, or food as a commodity, and with different combinations of searching tools. And I realized that there was a sharp contrast between close to 50,000 academic papers that where the consideration of food as a commodity or a private good was included, compared to only 179 that were including the consideration of food as a commons and public good. And actually then I cleaned those papers and I came up with a group of 70, only 70 papers where the consideration, alternative consideration of food as a commons or public good was explained. And I was analyzing those papers compared to a huge amount of academic materials that were positing, defending, or explaining in detail the idea of food as a commodity, or food is a commodity and a private good. But hopefully, and unfortunately also since the years 2000, and especially since the crisis in 2008, there is a growing number of papers devoted to those alternative framings of food. And how those framings, how do they matter? Why do they matter? And how relevant they are, those normative valuations of food, in order to shape policy options or policy preferences? Well, in this paper that I published in 2017, I wanted to test the explanatory power of both considerations, food as a commons or a commodity. So I was interviewing 95 food-related professionals working in the regime and the different alternative niches, and then those were active in the social network. So that's I was considering them as a community of practice, and based on their responses, I could split those 95 respondents into two big groups. One that was the gradual reformers, self-considered gradual reformers, and those that were self-considered transformers. And gradual reformers were positively correlated to the monodimensional valuation of food as a commons, whereas transformers were correlated to the idea of multidimensional food as a commons. And that's an important thing, although due to the reduced sample size, I could not find a causal relationship between the political stance and the food consideration. Then, in another paper related to the approach to food as a human right in international negotiations, especially the US and the EU positions, the paper published in 2016, I came up with this, let's say, relatively striking finding, is that food as a commodity is prevalent within those debates and pervades international negotiations. The consideration of food as a human right, it was even excluded from the SDG document. And the US has recurrently and constantly been against the consideration of food as a human right, whereas the EU and the EU member states, they have a timid or dual position. They support the right to food for international development, for others to implement, but they are quite timid, if not even reluctant, to enshrine the right to food in their constitutions and to include this mandatory right within their legal frameworks. Because at the end, both of them, they consider that as a commodity, the dominant hegemonic narrative of food, markets are the most efficient mechanism to allocate food instead of rights-based schemes, as the case for education or health in Europe, that are pretty much based on rights and entitlements. So just to end, based on that research, I realized that there was almost no theory of food as a commons, no theoretical elements that I could use to defend my thesis, so I had to invent my own approach. My own approach based on the multiple dimensions of food. So those are 6 dimensions that I came up with. As you have seen, food as a renewable resource, essential for human beings, food as a human right, a cultural determinant, food has been governed as a public good throughout history in several cases, but also food is a tradable good. Food is marketed, and it has always been traded for thousands of years. So it's not a problem. I'm not against that. But this dimension, the tradable dimension, is only one out of many others. In this case, out of 6. That are all those dimensions, all the others, they cannot be valued and monetized. They cannot be valued in monetary terms. Therefore, they can be tradable using money as an exchange mechanism. Those other dimensions, they render food as a commons, especially the essentialness of food for every human being. So food as a commons means revalorizing those different dimensions that are relevant to human beings. The first and foremost, that we need food to survive, the value in use, and also reducing the importance and the leverage that has at present, reducing the importance of the tradable dimension, the value in exchange, according to Marx's vocabulary. And then, as a practical approach on how we could do those things, I developed at the end of my research this tricentric proposal where the collective actions, partner states, and social markets, the 3 vortex of this pyramid, they should find a better balance. At present, the collective actions is pretty much cornered at the bottom left and occupying a very tiny space because the 99% of the global food market is either occupied by private enterprises, the market itself, especially capitalist market, or by the command and control state, the state that guarantees, in some places, a minimum access to food for some and for some non-privileged people and people, you know, food, the food poor, etc. So I propose a different type of market, social market. I propose a different type of partner state, and I propose that collective actions, they are supported and enabled to thrive. And I don't have time to explain specific policy options you have seen in the right box on the right, like farmer as civil servants or right-based food banks, etc., because I don't have time now to do it. And just to end, we can already, by the way, we can keep on the discussion, keep on discussing in the Slack and throughout the symposium, and I would be quite happy to exchange with you on that regard. So as a conclusion, as conclusions, commons and food have multiple understandings, and yet, so far, there is a dominant hegemonic narrative of food that sees food as a commodity or private good, justifying therefore justifying market mechanisms as the one and only allocation mechanism. And this dominant narrative of food as a commodity has been crafted, or at least informed, by the academia, with a great amount of papers defending and explaining that approach, that social construction. Academia that has been instrumental to provide elements for policymakers to keep on pushing for that social construction. And the economic narrative of food developed by academia is pretty much ontological and theoretical. And by being ontological, prevents other food approaches, other food understandings, other food meanings. Hopefully, and fortunately, other food meanings are already growing, gaining momentum, and thriving all over the world. So we need also to nurture those alternative food narratives that they see food differently and they oppose to food as a commodity. Food as a commodity that is dominant within gradual reformers, those who want to just to gradually increase or technically improve the flaws of the global food system. But conversely, the consideration of food as a commons, or the multidimensional consideration of food, it's prevalent in transformers, in those food agents that want to do things radically different. And the evaluation of food is correlated with specific food preferences. Fourth conclusion is that the narrative of food as a commodity is dominant also in the governmental arena, not just in the corporate world, but also in the governmental arena, with different governments already supporting this idea, and therefore defending the market-based mechanism as the only one, as the sole mechanism to produce and distribute food, especially to those who cannot afford it. And the non-dominant narrative, the fringe narrative of food as a commons or food as a human rights, it's, although growing, it's still a minority. And the idea of food as a commons encompasses the human rights-based mechanism. And this historical process of fully commodifying food, that it took several decades, it cannot be reversed overnight. So we will need multiple niches of alternative constructions of food narratives, polycentric niches. We will need several decades combining alternative food networks, customary food systems, and contemporary food options to rebuild the recommonification of food, or revaluation of food as a commons, as a public good and human right. In any case, just final thing, food as a commons, I think that has explanatory power, and it's worth pursuing because it has policy power to endorse and support alternative food policy options. And in any case, we cannot, food provision cannot be exclusively left to the market. Food as essential for human life cannot be exclusively guaranteed by anyone's purchasing power. That's all, and I hope that you will be able to combine this lecture with the other interesting presentations that we will see throughout during this seminar. So I will be glad to keep on working with you, exchanging with you in Slack. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you very much, Jose. As Jose just said, he's on Slack and he's waiting for your questions. So as we move on to the next presentation, please don't forget to drop a question or two for Jose that we can pick up in the discussion later. Or I'm sure if it doesn't come up in the discussion, he'll get to answer you eventually. So next, we will have the presentation from Akitsu Motoki-san, who will talk about grappling at food policy in Kyoto, experiences and future prospects. Let's have the next presentation. Please have a bit of patience with that while we figure out the next presentation. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Motoki Akitsu, a professor in Kyoto University and one of the working group leaders in the FITS project. The paper for this session is titled Grappling at Food Policy in Kyoto, Experiences and Future Prospects. Our project has almost finished, but our activity is still ongoing, so this paper is a kind of cross-section of the sequence cut by the position reached currently. The presentation is divided into 5 parts. Firstly, I mention something about action research. Secondly, uniqueness in Japan's food and agriculture. Thirdly, experiences from our action research and some lessons in the last. The goal of our action research is to build a Japanese version of food policy and a kind of organization like Food Policy Council that drives it. The first and most important task is to identify the most urgent issues in Japanese food and agriculture. So we introduce current problems in Japan's condition of food and agriculture before analyzing the process of our experiments. Creating byproducts is still underway. We feel difficult to produce academic outputs constantly in parallel with being involved in grappling at the social activism. In the description of our experiments, the 4 stages shown in the slide are used as a guideline. Our struggle for building food policies following them in principle. First stage is called visioning, including visioning workshops, seminars that find current problems and seek shared scenarios on local systems of food and agriculture. The second stage is to make an informal or formal organization that plays a role of driving a process. In the third stage, the action plan is devised through discussion led by the established organization. The fourth stage shows an interaction with policy-making process in local government. As mentioned before, uniqueness or characteristics in Japan's food and agriculture is set forth as a premise. This figure shows some major numeric data related to agricultural labor force in Japan. The shortage and aging of farm workers are critical challenges that Japan's agriculture faces. Not shown in the slide, but the disparity between urban center and the remote countryside is ever widening simultaneously. This line graph shows a long trend of food self-sufficiency rate in each country. Before the period of rapid economic growth, the rate was above 70%, but since then, it has decreased in a straight line and now is hovering under 40%. Comparing with other countries, we are in a group of East Asian countries having food insecurity. It is contrasted with some West European countries that have raised the rate during the same period. Such food insecurity in production side is the first characteristics as a backdrop. Meanwhile, thanks to our dietary habit, Japan enjoys a low rate of obesity, comparing to not only other developed countries, but also some other Asian countries. Our diet has changed drastically in just more than a half century, which is generally called westernization of food. Through the process, however, we have kept a pattern of diet that contains some amount of rice and seafoods, low fat and less mammal meat intake. The low obesity rate prevents non-communicable diseases caused by diet, like diabetes, from an urgent target in public health policy. This is the second feature of Japan's environment in food and agriculture. The third characteristic is related to low-level environmental activism. Most of us acknowledge global environmental problems like climate change, but there are only few actions among the people at large. The low diffusion rate of organic farming is one of the symptoms. The governmental extension service has been unwilling or even against to promote organic farming up to the present. Embracing the uniqueness in our mind, we selected two research sites, Kyoto City and Kamiyaka City, which are intimately tied together due to their close proximity. Kyoto City is a famous tourist place that has 1,480,000 population. The city signed Milan Urban Food Policy Pact in 2015, but nobody recognized it, even in municipal office. Kamiyaka City, that is 89,000 population, is located in the suburban area, having fairly amount of farmland. First, we look into the case of Kyoto City. This table shows a short history of our activities. We held public seminars on food policy and food policy council and conducted visioning and gaming workshops with citizen activists and city and prefecture officials at the early stage of the project. After the visioning stage, we declared to establish a local food policy council only with citizen activists and academics, because officials could understand the meanings of our intention, but were not mobilized. The reform of school lunch with more organic foods and the support for movement named Children's Canteen, a community kitchen that supplies meals for children in low-income families, was the first set of action plans. 2 years ago, active core members formed the Kyoto FPC more substantially and created a leaflet to advocate our mission. The above picture was taken at the first kickoff meeting of Kyoto FPC and the bottom one is a shot at the organic lunch seminar, gathering students who participated in an event of food and agriculture held in the Heritage Building of Kyoto Prefecture Office. This figure is on the page of the leaflet. We summarize current issues into 9 sections: safe food, urban agriculture, environmental sustainability, reduction of food waste, food education to children, health promotion, employment and economic development, emergency food delivery, and community development. Our Kyoto FPC haven't established institutional collaboration with the municipal government yet. We select 3 topics and approach to the government, holding a periodical meeting once a month. School lunch would be an effective leverage to indicate a direction for sustainability, but there's a great barrier to discuss with officers about such public procurement. So now we're targeting the lunch in kindergartens and nurseries run by private capitals. Urban agriculture has been paid attention to in the urbanized world. This fiscal year is a time to renew the 10-year agriculture and forestry policy in Kyoto City, and we have a chance to intervene its making process in the way that we involve a chair of the consultation committee into our member. It seems still difficult to overarch different administrative sections, but the intervention would be a possible opportunity to let city officials know our concept of food policy in practice. The last topic, compost, is related to food waste and material circulation. The handy compost kit in the picture prevails now in small-sized urban families under the staying at home caused by COVID-19. The material circulation around food would urge even city dwellers to consider production side of food. We move to the next case study in Kameoka City. At the beginning stage, food stakeholder workshops were conducted after brief research on food purchasing behavior. Participants in the workshops were not social activists, unlike the case in Kyoto City, selected from each section food system, and requested to attend a series of gatherings held 3 times. After the workshops, a kick-off meeting of the Kameoka FPC was held in order to build a preceding group for it, but failed. It provided us, however, a chance to meet a mayor of Kameoka City who participated in the meeting in a positive response to our invitation. After 2 seminars to seek for action plan, making Kameoka City an organic town was decided to be a slogan, and the first organic market was held, supported by a little bit by local government. It was natural in the area with abundant farmland that food policy focused on the production side of food system. We haven't built an apparent organization yet, but a combination of loose network of organic farmers and the staff of our university that started a revitalization program previously are co-working for progress. These are pictures in the respective event. Our current task is to start for organic farming in a city park designed for preserving a rare species of freshwater fish. Organic rice farming is required there in order to avoid the damage by chemicals. 3.5 hectares in the map will be allowed to be used for farming without chemical fertilizers or synthesized pesticides. We're going to make a group to be a contractor with the municipal government. The most important fact to establish food policy in Kameoka is that the mayor has a strong interest in environmental issues. The mayor supports our project positively, but city officers cannot catch up with his intention now. All of the listed activities have relationships with the municipal authority. Our project would progress in parallel with the development of minds of city officers. At the end, we will summarize lessons learned from the experiments. Because of underdevelopment of the NGO's potentials in Japan, the access to public authority is critical to transform social system. In Kyoto City, a rigid and inflexible sectionalism in the municipal government is a great barrier to construct cross-sectional policy scheme like food policy. The kind of sectionalism is common in the bureaucracy system anywhere in the world, but each society has its uniqueness. There's a custom that officers move across a section every few years in the Japanese bureaucratic system. So, it might be a long way to contact all the potential officers in charge of a particular section. Transition needs time. A rich history of the NGO activism is a hope for giving strength to our action in Kyoto City. In contrast, the mayor in Kamioka City leads officers to a kind of social transition oriented toward a more environmentally conscious city. A network of organic farmers is growing steadily. Our current tasks are to bridge the gap between local initiatives and municipal officials and to involve citizens in consumer side, introducing the participatory organic farming in the new city park. This reference list shows only a few. Sorry not to be perfect. This is the end of presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much to Akitsumoto-san, who will also be there for the discussion, of course. So if you have any questions about these fascinating case studies of how you tackle city governments in Kyoto and Kamioka to get some food policy done, then please place them in the Slack channel. Next up, we are moving towards the imagination and transformation with Astrid Magnus, who will present to us on evaluating futures for food systems change. So let's get started with the next presentation, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Astrid Magnus, and I am a PhD candidate at the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Since 2017, I've been working with the FEAST project on a series of futures workshops to develop a Kyoto Food Policy Council, and later we've been collaborating on the evaluation of those workshops. Today, I would like to talk to you about this path from imagination to transformation. Transformations to sustainable urban food systems are urgently needed as a key ingredient of more sustainable societies. According to the FAO, the divide between urban and rural areas is widening and cities are growing, and this challenge is becoming larger and more complicated. The task of feeding a growing urban population poses serious challenges in terms of equity, health, and ecology. At the same time, the imagination of alternative food futures is also complicated by the looming effects of climate change, resource depletion, and environmental pollution. New perspectives and strategies towards the future are needed to tackle these issues effectively. Methods of anticipatory governance are becoming increasingly used to develop networks for agenda setting and policy formulation. As tools of anticipatory governance, foresight methods can bring different actor coalitions together and help them develop and strategize for a range of different futures. While tools like scenarios, visioning, backcasting, and even more creative interventions like simulation games and art installations are becoming more popular, the evaluation of their effects is still underdeveloped. Especially for more experimental and critical futures, evaluation of their multiple effects is complex. Currently, evaluation is focused mostly on immediate responses of participants after a workshop or session. This undervalues foresight processes as a one-time event with one clear outcome, rather than as long-term processes that are integrated in governance practices. The evaluations that exist focus largely on policy or business settings, and foresight processes used by activist or bottom-up groups are largely absent. Me and my co-authors have developed a framework that assesses the factors that shape the success of a future intervention. Every scenario workshop, game, or visioning session takes place in a context shaped by the institutional landscape, the participatory culture, and project in which it is organized. Subsequently, these factors shape the outcome of this futures practice, which we have defined as the serious and inclusive consideration of alternatives in a pluralistic manner. But how can we measure the success of this outcome? Especially with a new and experimental practice like a game or an art experience. Moreover, how can we evaluate if the futures practice has reverberated beyond its own project and perhaps into the participatory culture and institutional context? Currently, a few authors are trying to develop methods to trace the outcomes of futures practices. Firstly, Aniek Hebink and her colleagues distinguish between the conceptualization of new futures and their initiation, any way in which they are realized in policy and society. Furthermore, Maarten Heijer and Peter Peltzer have tracked the effects of a multimedia intervention through discourse analysis, in which they record all new plans expressed in media, budgets, and official documents after their intervention. Finally, the Feast Project has been developing a social practice theory approach based on work by Elizabeth Shove and her colleagues. They track food systems change by looking at shifts in competencies, materials, and meanings. In case of the Kyoto Food Policy Council, we invited Kyoto food system practitioners to a series of workshops. These participants were all involved in a sustainable food practice, such as a farmer's market or a school lunch initiative, which we called a SEED, after the Seeds of Good Anthropocenes project. We hypothesized that bringing these existing practices or seeds together could outline more sustainable food futures for Kyoto. Moreover, they were a potential Food Policy Council member, members of a non-governmental group that would actively push for food systems change. In 2017, we held 3 types of workshops: visioning, in which participants outlined their ideal food futures; backcasting, where they developed strategies towards these futures working back to the present; and gaming, in which the players took part in a Food Policy Council simulation. In part 2 of the research, which started in 2018 and has been going on until now, we have tracked the effects of these workshops through interviews and discourse or document analysis. The futures workshops yielded a lot of interesting results in terms of learning about the Kyoto food system, networking opportunities for the participants, and it turned out that the simulation game was very effective in mobilizing participants for the Food Policy Council. We also found that this complementary approach made the workshop more effective. We published these results in a paper that came out last year. In part 2 of the research, I interviewed participants and organizers of the futures workshops about the outcomes. We divided the interview questions into 3 groups. The first one focused on starting conditions, the opportunity for change, institutional support, and the ambition for change. We found that especially the ambition was large, but the institutional support, for example, was not present yet. The second group of questions focused on the process of conceptualization of new futures, analyzing the participants and the role of researchers. We found that the Feast Project as organizer and presence in the Kyoto area was a strong advocate of the futures we developed in the workshops. The final group of questions considered the initiation of change. Here we found that some leading change makers in the Kyoto area had been instrumental in advancing the Kyoto Food Policy Council, and that the methodology and the seeds niche practitioners learning about each other's activities was very motivating and mobilizing for the group. Subsequently, we analyzed documents from the current Kyoto Food Policy Council, which became increasingly embedded in institutional context, and we studied documents from other backcasting and gaming sessions that were spin-offs from the first series of workshops that we did. Analyzing the interview and documentation results, we found a number of significant outcomes and lessons. Firstly, we found that the FPC as a governance mode was key in this process. It provided the framework for both the futures workshops and afterwards. After the workshops, people were already enthusiastic and motivated to join the FPC, and it remained the framework that organized the group. What we can learn from this is that when a bottom-up group wants to organize itself and strategize using futures tools, deciding on a governance mode can make a crucial difference. Secondly, we found that the seeds were effective. People were learning about each other's activities and were motivated to collaborate and support each other. A lesson we can draw from this is that involving existing good practices in an exploration of the future strengthens your process. Thirdly, we found that the methodology is important. A combination of methodologies can make for better plans, and attractive methods can lead to these methods being repeated and adopted in other contexts. Finally, we found that ownership of the process after the futures intervention was crucial. The project champions were key in this case. The second lesson we can draw from this is that the community building, which Feast had done before the workshops, was very beneficial. It can be very effective to first build a strong bottom-up community who really enjoys the process and spending time working on a better food system before taking this process to higher levels of governance or institutionalize it. So all in all, this was quite a rich set of findings, but thinking back to the futures framework at the beginning of this talk, can we say that the outcomes are a serious, inclusive consideration of food system alternatives? Firstly, the Food Policy Council as a collection of niche practices work both in the short and long term. People change their behaviors and routines after the workshops, which in the long term may lead to a change in materials, competences, and meanings, or in short, in practices. Secondly, and perhaps more surprisingly, the futures practices proliferated. We saw tools of anticipatory governance spread through participants in our workshops. This change and engagement with the future can increase the momentum, in this case for food system change, and enables scaling to other cities, organizations, and levels of governance. Finally, the Kyoto Food Policy Council has developed itself into an institutionalized group at the prefectural level. This is the kind of systems transformation that could lead to further sustainability transformations in the Kyoto food system. So, looking back to the framework to assess futures practices, it's interesting to see that firstly, there was a direct effect on the Food Policy Council project plans and on the participants in the workshops. However, we could also trace a reverberation into the culture around participatory futures. And finally, even in the institutional context. It is important to note that the further away you are from the futures practice, the less directly the effects can be attributed to this intervention. The installation of the Food Policy Council is a testament to the working group advocating for this new governance mode, rather than an effect of one single set of workshops. This illustrates how futures practices should be embedded in a larger governance process and lose a lot of their value when they are treated as one-off events. So, what lessons can we draw for the evaluation of futures practices involving bottom-up groups and experimental or critical methodologies? Firstly, it is important to look out for the proliferation of key concepts and practices. Secondly, new connections between people and organizations are important. Thirdly, the realization of new governance arrangements is important, as well as the proliferation of participatory futures methods. And finally, involving existing niche practices can bring in a direct effect on participant behavior with regards to the food system around them. To conclude, I have listed some generalizable insights from the Kyoto Food Policy Council case. I believe that researchers and practitioners aiming for food system transformations using futures practices can learn from these insights. Firstly, it's important to consider the local context and utilize its strengths. A strong embedding in this local context is important, as are the local connections that you have. Rather than developing a one-off workshop, for maximum effect, it's important to invest in a long-running process by allocating enough time, resources, and manpower. In this long process, trust and enthusiasm is key. A governance mode to frame the efforts can increase the effects as well, as can existing inspirational practices. Finally, methodologies such as a Food Policy Council simulation game can help in scaling a bottom-up movement. These insights kind of feed into these final remarks. I think we can conclude that the outcomes of processes such as Kyoto FPC are shaped by its process, results, key concepts, key actors, and methodology. As such, it should be considered as an organic experimental process characterized by iteration, replication, and structuration. There are opportunities for scaling in accessibility and replicability of the process. And finally, the project champions or key actors in a bottom-up group are the knowledge brokers. They are the ones that can connect the niche practices or seeds with the institutional context and embed them there, for example, in a food policy council. That was all for my presentation today. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Astrid. So for the folks who have questions for Astrid, please put them in the channel as well, and we'll get to them after our next and last presentation. So thanks for sticking with us, everyone, and now we'll hear from Kanang Kantamatu about constructing practice-oriented participatory policy for sustainable everyday urban food futures in Bangkok. Next presentation, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Kanang Kanthamathurapot. I am from Faculty of Social Science and Humanity, Mahidol University from Thailand. I have engaged with FIES project for 5 years, and today I would like to present my work with this project. The topic of my presentation is constructing practice-oriented participatory policy for sustainable everyday urban food futures in Bangkok. Sustainable consumption is one of Sustainable Development Agenda. The environmental problems such as climate change, flood, and water shortage may lead to food crises. Many scholars argue that consumers must rethink of their consumption practice to overcome food crisis and to ensure sustainable food consumption. The conventional response, such as market instruments, regulatory measures, information and communication campaigns, have been criticized that they are too reliant on individual behavior, but ignore the influence of existing social structure. Social practice approach provide alternatives to analyze a set of social practice influenced by social norms and lifestyle choice. This makes up research question for this study. Thus, focusing on social practice in policy creation process provide a way forward that does more than conventional response, and what is important in designing practice-oriented policy creation process. The study took place in Bangkok, the capital city of Thailand, and focused on 3 food-related social practices: food purchasing, eating out, and home cooking. The reason why we select Bangkok as the study site is because it offers a potential preview for sustainable food policy in ASEAN megacities, due to the fact that it is a highly urban middle-income country with a growing consumer class and has a history of shifting food practice and widespread concern for food safety. The multi-phase process of practice-oriented and participatory backcasting methodology was designed in this study. We start with visioning workshop, followed by scenario evaluation and transition framework development. And at the end, we aim to get the policy plan generated from the participatory process. The visioning workshop was conducted in 2017 with 36 consumers in Bangkok. And from this workshop, we got the ideas from consumers about sustainable food purchasing, eating out, and cooking in the next 30 years. Then in 2018, we had a researcher workshop in Kyoto. The future desirable scenario representing sustainable food consumption in the year 2015 were elaborated. The total 6 narratives of food practice were created by using the ideas from visioning workshop. The recognizable place in Bangkok and name of Thai food were used in the narrative to make the scenario seem familiar to Thai consumers. And these are 6 scenarios. For food purchasing, the first scenario is smart shopping for health and sustainability. It is a story about AI shopping bag recommending sustainable food options to our family members. The second scenario is accessible, affordable organic food. This is a story of grandma who consult her online cooking community in contact with farmer, become a CSA member where she can buy organic food in a reasonable price. For eating out, the first scenario is living in the sustainable community food system. The story is about businessman and wife go to a restaurant where you can only pay for dinner with your own agricultural products and digitally eat with friends from other continents. The second scenario is the taste of sustainability. It is a story of university students going to vegan restaurant equipped with the new noodle system. And with this system, people can see, feel, and hear the sustainability of the food and understand how food has all kinds of knock-on effects for the world. For home cooking, the first scenario is my optimized menu, a robot cooking food for all people in the condominium at a communal kitchen. And this robot scan health status of condominium members and cook food that fit for their health. The second scenario is the next generation of community chefs. It is a story of a family live in the condominium, and there is a community pantry in condominium where people can cook and share recipes. Then in 2019, we conduct the scenario evaluation and transition workshop in Bangkok again. This workshop includes 18 stakeholders from various sections, such as green consumers, mainstream consumers, innovative consumers, as well as the representative from public sector, research sector, and NGOs. Firstly, the participants were asked to act out a dramatic reading of the scenario narrative because we want the participants to put themselves into the stories. After that, the group participants share their views, discuss, and then vote on which of the scenarios were most desirable. The transition workshop began with a backcasting exercise in which group participants identified the scenario elements that were most critical to achieve a transition to the desired future scenario. Next, the interventions were developed over long-term, medium-term, and short-term for developing planning and policy pathway to the desired scenario future in 2050. And this is a result from transition workshop. In the workshop, the participants generated many intervention ideas. Then we evaluated whether the intervention ideas were conventional or practice-based policy. And we used this evaluation framework adapted from Spooling et al. He argues that conventional policy intervention tend to frame the sustainability problems as needing innovation and technology, achieve in choice or providing an alternative option, and behavior change. However, this approach has limited success and tend to push the responsibility to change onto individual citizens. So he pointed out that policy intervention could adopt a social practice orientation This would encourage policy to take into account more than just individual action, and embrace an understanding that practices are socially constructed. The intervention ideas that emerge with social practice perspective would see that more sustainable practice could be achieved by recrafting practice, substituting practice, and changing how practice interlock. And this is a result for future food purchasing. The selected scenario is accessible, affordable organic food, and based on the evaluation, most of the intervention ideas were conventional. This is the result for future eating out. The selected scenario is living in the sustainable community food system. Based on the evaluation, most of the intervention ideas were conventional as well. And this is a result for future home cooking. The selected scenario is the next generation of community chefs. Based on the evaluation, most of intervention ideas were practice-based policy. From the result, we found that not all practices are amenable to the methodology because the agency people perceive that they don't have to change a practice. Each scenario site the government has playing a critical role, but the governance structures are very compartmentalized and may be unable to integrate diverse elements that shape practice. For policy implications, most proposed interventions are meant for the government and private sector to perform. It is interesting to note that few interventions are consumers-oriented, which can be initiated and implemented by consumers. And for the contribution to research methodology, the study confirmed that experimental workshop space promote social learning, knowledge sharing, and collective action. The narrative style scenarios and incorporating drama are very powerful to illustrate possible futures and embedded participants into future everyday life. And that's all of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kanang. Let's see. There we go. Okay, we are now at the end of our presentations, so let's move over to the session discussion. We've heard a lot of different stories and ideas and concepts and results here. So, and I'm also aware that we are a little bit behind time. So what I would like to do is, rather than try to get through all the questions, I would like to go from speaker to speaker and maybe ask some of the folks who have asked a question in the channel to ask it again for everyone. And I'm gonna pick a few questions. So let's get started. The first question, I think, let's start with the first presentation. Joost, I hope you're there. And the question I would like to pick is from, let's see, from Rahat. Are you there, Rahat?
Yes, I'm here.
Would you mind, I think you asked a really interesting question in the channel. Would you mind repeating the question for yours? And then
yeah, surely.
Reflect a little bit on that.
Yeah, I actually have written it down also. So it's the anticipatory governance aspects of video games is kind of very interesting to me also because I have worked on one recently, which is a semi-educational kind of game based on the pathways. So my question is, how do we address the challenge posed by the fact that the darker futures of the imaginary, of the imagination, are often inherently more attractive to a player who approaches the game seeking entertainment, and could knowingly opt for those darker choices that the game presents. Is there still a scope to nudge this person towards the alternatives? Basically, it's a question about educational games and commercial games and the distance between them. Thank you.
Yeah, just to jump right in with your permission, Christoph. Thanks, Ahab. I think this is a really interesting question that sort of cuts to the core of a lot of interesting things about playing with narrative in games and sort of story setting. I would say that I don't think we should fight this impulse. I think that it's very, first of all, it's very interesting for people to explore some darker choices and to see how these things work, because they never get to do it in a normal setting. So-called dark play, playing around with sort of dark and difficult options in games is a really good idea. Generally, though, I would say that it's true that darker, more dystopian narratives are very popular in games, and I think that the answer to sort of the question around this isn't necessarily to only focus on utopian games instead, but actually to, I think that we want to build transformative games that focus on transformation. And transformation, of course, has a lot of conflict and winners and losers, and things are changing, and ways of life are changing. So people are struggling and fighting sort of incumbent actors in whatever arena. And so I think that there is actually a lot of scope for combining more utopian and dystopian strands in a mix that creates transformative games that don't pretend that things are all wonderful, but that nevertheless focus more on positive change. Secondly, I would say that even though many games do focus on sort of dystopian or conflict-focused settings, there are also, of course, plenty of commercial games, for instance, that really are very popular exactly because they have a more sort of harmonious setting. So I think of a game that was very important to many people this year, which is the new Animal Crossing. Has a very sort of collaborative, harmonious atmosphere, and there are also plenty of people who are attracted to this kind of setting as well as a way to engage with games. I have a PhD student, Karin Moosdorf, who's studying the joy of creating institutions in games and the role of care as a motivator for gameplay. So there's a lot of scope there, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joost. So the next question I would like to ask Jose, and the question I think I'm gonna pick is, because I think this is really a big one, the question from Noriev. Would you please ask the question?
Yes, hello, thank you. My name is Norie Tamula from Link. So I think it is easier for people to regard the situation like the simple structure, simple dichotomy, like the one side there is a evil enterprises, and the other side there are the very good but poor citizens. But in reality, many people believe or convinced that those who do not work should not eat or something like that. Those kind of the phrases are found in many traditional, how do you say, the narratives over the different cultures. So I am wondering, how could we dissolve this kind of traditional moralistic perspective? It's my question.
Well, good morning. Can you hear me well? Yes, Christoph?
Yes, we can hear you. Maybe
okay,
a little bit louder if possible.
Well, let's see. It's not the. Let's see. Maybe close, perhaps now.
Yes, I think it's good.
Okay, I cannot shout very loud because here in Dublin, my family is still sleeping. So, as you have seen, I woke up very early. But I've already, Norie's question is, the first thing is very relevant because it's true, and it's not, it's true that in many cultures, different religions, especially, for instance, Catholicism, and I remember, I don't remember if it was Platon or Aristotle, but both, any of those, one relevant Greek philosopher also was writing about this, that those who don't work, or those who don't want to work, the idle ones, they shouldn't be fed, or they shouldn't be entitled to eat, because you need to earn. That's basically Catholicism and the foundational myths of Catholicism. They say that before we were living in the paradise, we were gaining the bread with our without even sweating, and because of women, we were punished by God, and we left paradise, and that's a foundational myth. And we left paradise, and we had to start working to eat. We have to start farming, and we have to start suffering in order to eat. So those who don't suffer, they shouldn't be entitled to it. But that's just a moral consideration, okay? And that's a social construct. It means that it's a framing, it's a narrative that has a moral valuation behind. But moral valuations, they are not rigid, they're not carved in stone, and therefore they can be modified. And there are many things that throughout history, many moral considerations have been modified. And I'll give you just two quick samples just to show that we can do that with regard to food. The first one is slavery, okay? I mean, since the beginning of history, since we left the trees and we started organizing ourselves in societies, there have been slaves. And slaves meant a commodification of human beings. Human beings were deprived from their humanity, and they were considered things. Okay, things that could be exchanged and traded, so commodities. But slavery ended up a couple of centuries ago. I mean, in England, they started to realize that due to moral considerations, it was not good to have slaves, and slaves were also human beings. So there was a kind of commodification of humans again, and it's because morals shifted. Okay, so it can be done. I'll give you another example: education or health. Both of them have been treated as commodities again throughout history, because only those who were wealthy enough to pay for mentors or to pay for doctors could afford to be healed or to be educated. But after the Industrial Revolution, and especially in the Weimar Republic, there was a moral shift. There was, and therefore, a political movement to grant a minimum access to health and education to everybody, and that's why we became, we found the universal health systems and the universal educational systems. So those moral considerations can be shifted, can be changed if we consider that it's important for us. And the idea, that's the powerful idea, that food is essential for everybody, that is not just an idea, it's a fact, okay? It may imply that we can devise a specific governance mechanism to guarantee that everybody has access to food. Because before, and that's a huge difference that I didn't mention to Nori in the Slack thread, but before, especially, let's say in the Middle Ages and later on, the world was not producing enough food to feed everybody. Therefore, food was at a certain point a scarce resource. The demand was higher than the offer. But at a certain point in the 20th century, we have reached a level where we produce more than enough to feed everybody well. So now it's not the resource scarcity anymore. So there are plenty of food for everybody. And yet, there are still 800 million people that are officially undernourished, and we are not eating well because we are wasting food, and at the same time, I mean, more than 1 billion are becoming overweighted and obese. So it's now time, a due time, to shift this consideration of those who don't work should not be entitled to eat, because we can afford, as a wealth society globally, to enable everybody to eat if we shift the moral value, and therefore we shift the policies in order to be aligned to this new morality.
Thank you. That's a powerful answer.
Thank you very much. Yes. I mean, this topic comes up again and again, so I thought I'd highlight that question. So the next question will be for Activism, and I think Stephen had a question, maybe a bit different from that in the channel, but yeah, would you like to ask your question, Stephen?
Sure. Thank you very much. Aki Sensei, onegaishimasu. In the comment to Astrid, we have a little discussion going on there. You're talking about in Japan to promote activism. I think that we feeling is very important. Can you go in a little bit more detail about what you mean about this feeling of we feeling and how the experiences in Kyoto and Kameoka were able to develop that feeling together amongst the actors?
Okay, thank you very much. So based on our experience in the Kyoto and Kameoka, so we imagined that the first stage and the second stage and third stage, fourth stage. But the first stage we held a variety of the seminars or the workshops, so to extend our the idea to the public. But after the second stage, first we have to establish the organization groups, but we faced difficulty to group the members or recruit the members to promote together to a purpose. It's a so I feel that it takes a long time to establish a group to share our idea, or some have a same intention. So if we have some feelings in the same group, so it means we feeling, so we can move together to the direction. That's a meaning.
Thank you.
Thank you. So let's move on. I have a question for Astrid by, let's see, by Rob Booth, who, one second, if we can, there we go. Rob, would you like to ask the question directly?
Yes. Hi, thanks everyone, and thanks for this excellent symposium. Really enjoying it here in London this morning. My question for Astrid, oh, sorry, just let me return to the page just so I get it right. My question for Astrid was around the sort of general attitudes towards the future and some of the emotional attitudes towards the future that she encountered in her work undertaking these foresight processes in Kyoto. To what extent was there variability in some of the attitudes towards the future? To what extent did participants understand the future as open or closed by existing structures? And how can we link these emotional sort of affective atmospheres to the success and impact of foresight processes? And Astrid replied, and I'd also like to add a little bit onto that, and I wonder if there's any comparisons Astrid can make perhaps from her work in different national contexts as well. Thank you very much for the opportunity to ask this question.
Yes, can everybody hear me okay?
Thank you.
Yes, okay, great. Yeah, thanks Rob for your question. I think it's really interesting, especially to compare different cultural contexts. Yeah, I already gave you a little bit of a reply in the Slack channel, but I can elaborate a little bit, I think. I found that in the Kyoto context, like it has this really well-known, really famous food culture that goes back a long time. And people feel really attached to that, I found. And it also has like a historical bottom-up scene or ecosystem where there are a lot of people involved in local food initiatives and niche practices. And like Akit Sensei also mentioned, I think in the Slack and in the answer of the question just now, is that this we feeling is very important to people, and this community at the local level that is involved in changing local food practices. But it stands kind of in contrast to a quite hierarchical governance structure that Japan is also characterized by. So I found that among our participants, this feeling of being able to change the food future or the food present was not so strong in terms of changing the governance structure or going to local government to advocate for certain changes. Even though in the Food Policy Council, of course, this is done to an extent. Yeah, so that's different in different countries. Like, for example, the Netherlands, where I'm from, it's much more horizontal. People are quite vocal and complain a lot to local governments to change certain things. And you also asked in Slack in the ways in which we can, let's see how you say it, how efforts to evaluate foresight practices account for these existing structures of feeling or effective environments. And I think in terms of the Kyoto case, on the one hand, we can say like that we kind of use this existing feeling of community and like this active bottom-up scene, and that's one way to increase the impact and also evaluate the outcomes. And on the other hand, these foresight practices, I think, can also serve to sort of break through the hierarchical structures. And we've also talked about breaking through disciplinary silos in governance. So we tried to do that with the Kyoto Food Policy Council game, and that's also a way in which you can evaluate the success, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, I see there's still lots of discussion going on Slack, and a discussion that will continue on Slack. So moving on to the last presentation, Kanang, I have a question for you from Max. Max, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Christoph. I wanted to know, Kanang, if in your 5-year experience, wrong microphone, maybe. Sorry about that. So in your 5-year experience working with these methods, have you seen other projects also picking up these type of methods over the time? Like, are people who participated in the workshops picking them up, or is anybody around you doing such work in Bangkok? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Max, and nice to see you. No, I haven't seen other projects like this before. And the future research and visioning workshop are very new for Thailand. And in the workshop, I asked the participants whether they have been participated in the future workshop like this before, and all of them say no. So it is very interesting for me and very useful. But I found that in the workshop maybe it's difficult for the participant to imagine or to project for the future, like 30 years in the future. Maybe it's too far. So maybe we need to empower the consumers and increase their capacities for the future literacies. And maybe we need more research like this in food issues.
Thanks. Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. So I see we are at the end of the time for today, after doing only one round for all of the speakers, which is kind of sad, but thanks again to all of the speakers, and everything is not over because we will actually do a quick little get together after the session in the spatial chat. We will put the link in the session channel as well, but you can also find it in the announcement channel. We did it yesterday and it was kind of fun, so we'll do it again today. You can mingle there and discuss a bit more with the rest of the group what you think about the topics you heard about today. And then, well, officially then today will be over, but we hope to see all of you again tomorrow at the same time. We'll be again in the, well, the Asian afternoon and Europe early morning to morning time slot. And thanks again to all who joined us today, regardless of the hour of the day. And we hope to see as many of you as possible again tomorrow, where we will have no keynote, but a very interesting session on food alternatives in the present. And then we will have a fantastic practitioner roundtable with some folks who really know what they're talking about from Japan, from India, and from the UK. So I think tomorrow will be also a really exciting day. Thanks again for joining again today, and that will be all from me today. See you in the spatial chat. Bye, and have a nice evening, morning, afternoon.